Great. So I'll just say a few words of introduction. My name is Laurelène Piron, and I'm a director at the policy practice. Together with my colleague W01, we've decided to organize a session to really share some of the knowledge that we have about both writing policy, but also influencing policy.
Yeah, thanks very much. Can you hear me now? Is this better?
Perfect, Ollie.
Okay,
you're
that's
on.
great. I have no idea. I wasn't muted, but it was muting me. So this is some of the glitches that we have. Great. As Laurelène has started to introduce, we at the policy practice specialize in political economy analysis and working with policymakers to bring political economy and politics into the picture. And we realized that we spend a lot of time communicating in this way, and that actually a lot of our colleagues in the Global South and early careers researchers kind of would like to and end up having to feel their way through those processes. And we thought that it would be good to put something together that helps. We won't call it a masterclass because I don't think we can call ourselves masters, but we have experience in different roles in this. And we thought it would be an opportunity for you to come to that and share in it. And maybe we can help you with some of the things that you would like to do. So the way that we're going to structure this, it's going to be pretty open. We are going to start off with our own introductions. We would like then, Laurelène is going to take over and you can introduce yourselves a little bit, and please do that very succinctly because I think there's a group of more than 10 and we would need to get through that fairly rapidly. So just say 4 or 5 lines on what you do and what your interest is so that we can shape what we say to that. And then Laurelène, David and I, who I'll introduce properly in a moment, are going to run through our own 10-minute presentations on our own insights on our own areas that we've learned from and we've learned with. And then if everybody wants to do it, we'll check later in the session, but we're going to do a little practical exercise. We're going to have a look at a couple of existing papers that people have and sort of feel what it's like to kind of read them in a hurry, under pressure, as policymakers often do, and glean points from them. And kind of you can criticize them interactively about what you felt was strong or weak about them and how you would do it, and maybe help to think you through some of the practicalities of what you do and sort of make you conscious of some of the choices about editorial choices. So that's what we're going to cover. And actually what we're going to do is all of us as speakers are going to introduce ourselves. I'll put up a background so you can see on the slide what everybody's name is if you miss it in the presentation, but I would hand over to Laurelène to begin on that now as I sort out the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Great. So my name is Laurelène Piron, and I'm a director of the policy practice where Ollie is also active. It's a niche UK-based company, and we work on political economy analysis. We're trying to promote this way of seeing the world and to shape policies and development programs so they're really based on a really good understanding of how countries operate and the political economy factors. And of course, that's something that's quite critical to understand how policy is made and can be influenced. A bit more about my background. I spent most of my career in DFID, which I joined in 1998. And as some of you may know, DFID is about to be abolished. So for those of us who were in DFID in the very early days, it's a very sad moment, but we'll get a chance to talk a bit more about it. I've also worked for 4 years with the Overseas Development Institute. So I've got experience of being both outside and inside of government. And finally, I wanted to say that we're really, really pleased that we have David joining us so that you will have not just a UK perspective, but an African perspective. So now, David, over to you. Can you just introduce yourself briefly?
Thank you very much, Laurelène and Ollie. It's an honor to be part of this workshop and to actually share the Ugandan experience. It's been quite an interesting and insightful experience, reflecting over the work we've done over the past 10 years to build political leadership for social protection in Uganda. I work as a policy and advocacy advisor. Here, I joined as an economist in 2010 and then oversaw the analytical work that we did with academia and other research organizations to help develop Uganda's social protection policy. And then 2 years after that, I joined the advocacy world and started selling the evidence that was emerging. So I was able to kind of marry the research side of things to the policy application, including using research to influence political decision makers for social protection in Uganda.
Thank you very much, David. So now we're going to do something a bit experimental. We'd like you to come up to the podium to introduce yourselves. But first, I would like to just say a few technical words, which is we've got Vida volunteer who's helping us on the tech side. So if you've got any technical issues, use the text chat to write the questions. If you've got any questions for us, you can use a question format or raise your hand. And I've got a colleague called Alex who will come and ask you how things are going. But right, and also as a favor, it'd be great if you could all go into public mode so we can see your faces and your reactions, because some of you are all in private mode, so we can't really see how you're engaging with us. So can I please ask Alex to turn us into the open podium mode and then remove Ollie and the PowerPoint from the stage. And then I think the open podium someone should just try to come up to the podium. Hello, introduce yourself, please.
Hello, everyone. My name is Teboho Kolosha. I'm from the city of East London in South Africa. I'm the head of economic governance program at the government-linked think tank here in one of the provinces of South Africa. I've attended one of your trainings before on political economy analysis. So this is how I got the invitation.
Great.
To be here. So,
welcome.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. The next person, please. Introduce yourself. Not David, but the other person on the screen. There's someone who's on mute and in private mode. Jackson from Kenya? Okay, we can't hear you, can't see you. Can I ask someone else to come up to the podium? Can I ask? Go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me?
Perfectly, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for this panel. It seems insightful. I'm Linda Nakato, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Agder in Norway, but I'm originally from Uganda. Hi, David. Yeah. So I research on grassroots finance, specifically savings groups, and I intend to do more kind of policy influencing research and not just specifically academia, no offense. Yeah, so that's why I find this really interesting. Thank you.
Great. Can I ask the next person, Alice, to introduce herself? I think, Alice, you're not visible and we can't hear you. And nor can we hear Jackson. So it'd be great, Vida, if you could help our two colleagues. But we have our colleague from Sao Paulo. Anna, can you introduce yourself? Okay, so I'm going to take a decision that this is not quite working as we were hoping. I think it's because colleagues need to be visible. Yes. So Amit, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah. My name is Hamid Khalafullah. I'm based in Khartoum in Sudan. I work as the head of policy and research for the British Council in Sudan, working on a macro governance reform project for DFID. And I'm also currently doing the political economy analysis in action course by the policy practice.
Great, welcome. So if there's anyone else who'd like to come to the podium, please come, but you have to go into public mode. So I will give it 1 more minute. Otherwise, we will stop the open podium. One final person who's in public mode who wants to come up?
Yes,
hello.
Hello. My name is Uli Imler. I finished my PhD. I am basically an early career researcher, and I'm trying to find my feet. And yeah, I'm interested in policy and understanding of it and how academia can influence policy. And yeah, my focus is on slum health, and my research location was in South India. So.
Okay, great, thank you very much. So we're going to close the open podium now, and anyone who wasn't able to go and introduce themselves, oh, one more person from India. No, she's gone, sorry. If you weren't able to go to the podium, just put it as a question and we'll publish the question. And in the question, put your name and country where you work and your research agenda. So we'll try to manage introductions in that way. Great, so now I'm going to be speaking and I'll be sharing with you some insights from my career. And these are really informal comments. I haven't prepared a PowerPoint. I want this to be really interactive and a bit more of a personal reflection. So the key message I want to share with you is that to understand how you can influence policy, you have to understand how policy is made. So it's all very well to be an expert in a very specific technical area, but if your aim is to influence how a government at the national level, the local level, the international level operates, you have to either yourself or through colleagues will understand the system. And I'm going to be speaking to you from two perspectives. So as a governance expert within the FID, and I'll share with you how I've seen evidence used and how I've seen evidence actually influence decisions. And then also highlights from my time in ODI and with the policy practice when I was trying to influence some policy from the outside. So the first point that you have to ask yourself as an academic or a think tank is whether your audience really cares about evidence or not. Because there's no point sending a very long detailed report to officials if no one is ever going to bother reading it. And this is where I think the FID was quite exceptional. When I joined it at the end of the last century, and there was a real momentum to refocus all our work on poverty reduction. And that meant we had to understand how poverty was shaped, how it could be fought, different strategies, and that really required new evidence. And I think that was part of the shift in DFID. But also over time, we were able to get an increased research and evidence budget. So the FID was investing more in UK and international academic programs. And we had as our head of our research division, someone who's now really well known in the UK because he's leading on the medical side the response to COVID-19. It's Professor Chris Whitty, who's a very respected academic. And he introduced really rigorous processes to assess the evidence. And that was because as the aid program was increasing, as the research budget was increasing, he had to show the money was being spent properly. And you will see that DFID invested in literature reviews, evidence papers. There's a great center managed from Birmingham University called the Governance Social Development Resource Center, which really does summaries of evidence for policymakers. And I would encourage all of you guys to look at it. I'll put the link later on in the chat box. So in DFID, my colleagues and senior colleagues really cared about evidence. However, in practice, on a day-to-day basis, the way in which decisions are made are not always based on evidence. And I would say in my experience, it's often about looking for the evidence that you need to justify your policy position or the programs you have. So for a long time, I was an expert on security and justice, and I would advise the FID on how to invest in programming to make people have better access to justice. And I would look around online or meeting academics to see who was making a good case for the policy I was advocating within the FID. So that's the first myth, that you really have to be realistic and pragmatic and be aware that governments are elected on political platforms. Civil servants that you're trying to influence have to deliver what the government wants. In 1997, the UK wanted to focus on poverty, and that was really an opening. Now times are really changing, and you, in the UK and globally, in response to COVID-19. And it may be that the hook you have to have is the hook around COVID-19, even if your research interest is different. A second message that I would like to share with you is that time is critical. You may be doing research or advocacy on an issue for years and years, but then suddenly there will be a moment when you can have influence. And as an external person watching governments, you have to sort of monitor when might be a good time. So I'll give you there an example of a one-off opportunity. In 2009, I was working in DFID, and we were having to write a white paper because the Secretary of State at the time, called Douglas Alexander, wanted to show how the development program was going to respond to the financial crisis from 2007 to 2009. You had this really tough economic crisis, and the British government with Douglas Alexander and Gordon Brown wanted to show how our development efforts were going to be targeted to address the crisis globally. So he had one big idea, but that wasn't really enough, from my experience, to write a full white paper. So we were spending a lot of time looking for what we called policy offers or unanswerables, headline statements that would indicate how the FID and the UK government were changing. And they were not empty requests we were making. We wanted something with substance and that would make a real difference to the world. So within my ministry, every technical team had to look for new ideas they could put forward. And this was the time when you, as an external researcher or think tank, you really had to think through whether you had good networks that you could use to influence those teams looking for evidence. So there was a wonderful opportunity. And if you had the right networks, if you had the right research that was there positioned at the right time, you could have had an influence. But as I said, it's not just a one-off moment where you rapidly do research and present that. Actually, it's about the ability to build up a really strong evidence base over time and develop the networks to share it and building that momentum for an issue to become more important. So again, reflecting on my experience in DFID as a justice advisor, from around 2006 onwards, I was a technical lead in DFID, and I was trying to make the case that justice really mattered. But senior managers were not really interested. Ministers did not care so much about security and justice for the poor. So I got on with my work at the technical level. I would fund programs in countries, research activities with foundations, the Open Society Institute and others. We would try to make the case for how we could deliver better support to security and justice. But I wasn't getting traction with ministers. However, at the end of the white paper process, when my colleagues and I were still looking for big ideas, I said, well, I've got some ideas because I've been working on this for a very long time. Can I please make the case? And because colleagues and ministers were looking for big unanswerables, I was able to put together an argument that we should treat justice as a basic service, like health, education, social protection. And because we made the case at the right time, using evidence that we had built up over the years, we were actually able to get that into the white paper. And over time, it led to, I think, some improvements in funding for those programs, much more access on women's needs. Violence against women became a big issue over time. So this is just to show you a combination of how timing is critical, but it's also the longer term efforts that you have to make. Next point, the content of your research is really important. So I said to you, understand who you're trying to influence, when you're trying to influence policymakers. But of course, you have to have evidence of high quality. So you have to have a credible methodology because you will get challenged. And this is why the work that Chris Whitty and others did in DFID in the Research and Evidence Division has been so important. Within government, there's clear criteria to assess evidence. But it's not just the quality of the evidence, it's also how you make the arguments. So you have to understand the types of arguments that are valued and the kind of data that is valued at different times. So if I look back at when the FID was created and there was this greater focus on poverty reduction, what really mattered as a new source of evidence were all the surveys done by the World Bank and others called Voices of the Poor and participatory poverty assessments. And it was that kind of evidence that had real resonance with senior managers and ministers. And it's one of the ways in which initially we could make the case for security and justice, because we were saying, look at the surveys. Poor people themselves in developing countries are saying it matters how the police treats them and asks for bribes. It matters whether or not they can go to court and get a divorce. It matters that actually they can only get justice through their local communities, and actually that's what they really care about, not formal courts. Or for example, thinking through the argument you make, I would say for the left-wing Labour government, ministers were interested in what we call access to justice for citizens. But when the government shifted to a coalition government in the UK and then to just a conservative government, it was better to frame your arguments in terms of rule of law and law and order and security, rather than have as a headline access to services. So this is about really understanding your audience and the arguments that will be acceptable. And finally, the way you present arguments has to be a continuation of an ongoing discussion. You have to be aware of what's already well known within government circles. How is the policy framed around the issue you're researching? And how can you add to that discourse? So I will give you a different example. DFID for a long time has been working on conflict and fragile states. And in 2010, DFID and others put forward an approach called state building and peace building to say this is how we should work differently in those contexts. And at the time, we thought more access to services would be good and would contribute to stability. And then questions were raised about whether or not that was true, whether just giving people access to education or healthcare could actually help a country move away from conflict. And this were a number of programs, some of which were funded by DFID, researched the issue. And there was a debate ongoing about it. And because some of those programs fed directly into DFID, some of my DFID colleagues were able to directly receive those papers. And one key argument was around, it's not just providing services, but it's how services are provided. And that quick headline message, how services are provided, was a shorthand to say, services are provided in a way that's not discriminatory. People can see the government cares about them. There's accountability, there's redress, and that's how you can actually increase trust in government, increase legitimacy, and that might contribute to less fragility. So it's a very long argument that my colleagues were making on the research side, but the way we were able to provide a shorthand within government is to say, think not just about services being provided, but it's how services are provided. And that became a headline message people could actually understand within government. Finally, just two headline messages or tips to share is how you write. How you write your paper has to be really accessible. In government, staff don't have any time. Anything more than 2 pages requires them to take some time off their day-to-day work. So short policy brief, 2 to 4 pages, might get read, might get circulated. Anything more, sort of 20 pages might be a maximum for technical experts in government who really care about an issue. But more than 10 pages, you won't get read. So write short, memorable headline messages and then short papers. And your recommendations in your papers have to be really precise, very actionable. Think about who will read your text and what they need to do in their day-to-day job. So even think about the individual that might be implementing the policy or advising their minister on the policy, and think about the constraints they face and what would help them make the case. And then the final point, which I know goes beyond writing policy, but it's about the person who's writing the policy. So some of you will be excellent writers, but others will be really good champions and really good verbal communicators. And you'll be able to be seen as championing the issue in public, in the media. You'll be able to create networks so that there's a committee around you making the same case. You need to be able, some of you would be really good at saying something very sharp in just a few minutes. And often that's the way in which you can influence ministers. So again, when I was in government on a number of policy issues, I knew that to influence a minister, the case could be made much better by an external expert, but that expert had to be experienced in presenting his case or her case in a very short, sharp manner to a minister who would not listen to him or her for more than 5 minutes. So this is what we call an elevator pitch. Think about what you would say if you just had 30 seconds or 1 minute to someone very senior who doesn't really care about the issue. So think about that human dimension. Something else that can work, and it's not very rigorous academic evidence for some, but it is for others, especially anthropologists, is to think about the human interest story. Make the case for what matters from the point of view of a person in the country where you live or the country you're researching, and communicate your findings around that human interest story. And that, I think, has really worked in a number of cases. And finally, and because I work on thinking, work in political approaches and political economy, what matters also is alliances, working with others to make your case. Within your organization, some of you are good researchers, others are good communicators, but also other organizations will be able to present messages differently. Some may have better access, some can be more critical from the outside. And for those of you who know this work around thinking and working politically, we've been creating this alliance for the last 15 years, and over time getting more people on board because we've got this broad-based network globally with experts in the Global South, people like us trying to make the case in the UK, academics in Harvard, and all of that creates a general pressure and process over time to change how policy is made. So these are just my quick tips from my experience as a government official, both trying to influence from the outside and from the inside. Now I'm going to ask for David to come up, because David will be sharing his expertise of influence policy in government, but in Uganda, whereas I've been talking to you about how to influence policy in the UK. Over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Lauren. In my introduction, I think I didn't explain exactly the program I work on, but I work on the Expanding Social Protection Program. It's a Government of Uganda program that's started in 2010, and it's financed by the UK government, the DFID, as well as Irish Aid. It was approved by Cabinet in 2010, and it had a very clear long-term goal of embedding a national social protection system within Uganda's national planning and budgeting frameworks. And so before the design of this program, a very comprehensive assessment of the socioeconomic, institutional, as well as political context was conducted. And I think, having read all the different design documents, I must say that, this is one of the programs that was designed to succeed, because there was very nuanced evidence conducted by a range of people. Academia in Uganda were involved, had a lot of powerful research agencies across the world. In South African Economic Policy Research Institute was involved. DFID actually hired a management agent, Maxwell Stamp, who are now no longer in business, but they basically were able to mobilize a lot of high-level technical assistance to support the process of design. So right at the beginning, this is a program that valued the use of evidence. It was designed based on evidence, and in fact, consistently, evidence was very prominent in the way the business of the program was being run. So it had 4 objectives, which basically were based on the assessment of that context. The institutional assessment basically concluded that government had very weak social protection leadership and delivery systems. So there's an objective about building leadership and delivery capacity. But also, social protection was quite new, and so we needed to develop a social protection policy framework. So that was the second objective. And the third was to actually test a social protection program, a cash transfer pilot, which was important for generating evidence to respond to the assessment of awareness, but also skepticism about social protection in general, because social protection was very new. And so the program was designed to deliver a cash transfer pilot to generate that evidence of its feasibility, because at the beginning of the 2000s, there was a lot of evidence coming out of Latin America in particular. And I think DFID and other international agencies played an important role in that south to south transfer of social protection experiences. But locally, there was really not much evidence. And so the SAGE pilot was designed to generate that evidence of feasibility, but also impact, and also to provide a reference point for policy influencing. And all those, capacity building initiatives, the pilot on the ground, really were important for building government commitment, public support, and which is important for investing in social protection for the long term. So, my question for this panel was, how did the program work with use evidence, academic evidence, to influence policy development. And so this introduction really shows you that academic evidence and evidence in general was important for the design of the program. The Ugandan Economic Policy Research Center was very critical to the analysis of the socioeconomic context. They were also important for the design of the program. Where should the program be piloted? So the poverty analysis, the institutional assessments also benefited from the work of the Economic Policy Research Center. But also they were very important in terms of the knowledge management. So sharing the evidence that was coming out of all this research and the pilot itself. And the program was building on their capability, because the Economic Policy Research Center, as an example, is a highly credible research institution in Uganda. They are very good at knowledge management. And so wherever possible, we leverage that capability and credibility to actually put our message out, because the program was addressing some of the main concerns within government, in particular Ministry of Finance, which was, these programs can cause dependency and laziness. These programs are not affordable. We don't have the fiscal space. And so all our research was designed to respond to some of these concerns. In fact, I remember in 2012, our first advocacy and influencing strategy had like two strands. One, directly addressing the skepticism within the Ministry of Finance, but then the other one also addressing politicians and the general public skepticism about social protection. And so it was important to use evidence to diffuse some of the skepticism, to bust the myths about social protection, generating laziness or having impacts on fertility. And so for the first 2 years of the program, between 2010 and 2012, we actually focused on generating communication material to bust these myths. So we had a lot of myth busters there. And then as the program got implemented, the pilot, then we started, there was an impact evaluation of this program and some ad hoc one-off studies, including exit surveys during pay point. And we use this to expose politicians as well as other policymakers to what evidence was coming out of the program, and then documenting that and sharing it quite broadly. I think the other area where we worked was how to, we had a very good understanding that there is a limit to the technocratic process of, let's do a good policy. This is what the analysis of the context suggests. And so therefore we will go and invest so much more. So we conducted a lot of political economy analysis to help us understand what the concerns of the politicians were, but also, what did the government care about, especially the presidency, because in Uganda, the president is the de facto minister of finance. And so you need to understand what kind of interests him. And so because that required us to work politically, and this is a government program, we actually had to build coalitions with people in civil society as well as academia to help us with carrying some of these messages, because Uganda's development plan for the past 10 years, was trying to avoid using the word poverty. And if you really look through our national development plans, it's all about, in socioeconomic transformation. The arguments from the Ministry of Finance was that we spent the past decade trying to fight and eradicate poverty. Now it's a time to kind of fast track development. But of course, poverty remains a big issue in Uganda. And so as a government program, we had to be very careful about how some of these messages about poverty and understood. So for Ministry of Finance, we're talking about how social protection enhances economic growth. There was some concerns about inequality, but not very much. And so at the end of last year, we actually were working with the Ministry of Finance to conduct a macro level simulation of the impacts of social protection on the economy. And several other studies were conducted by other researchers. But in particular, the civil society organizations were also critical for building grassroots demand for social protection. Basically, these civil society organizations, which had networks across the districts, were recruiting their district offices to mobilize opinion leaders at district level and take them to visit SAGE programs to see the evidence that was emerging, and basically making neighboring districts of the SAGE pilot jealous. And this is really how we were able to build grassroots demand across the country. And in fact, in 2008, there was unanimous support for the national scale-up of the SAGE pilot, which I talked about at the beginning. So civil society organizations were very important. And then finally, out of the influencing work that the program was engaged in, we were conducting a lot of study tours. We took politicians to South Africa, Southern Africa, Lesotho, Mauritius. And on one of those field visits, the politician said, this is a fantastic idea, especially the team that went to Lesotho and South Africa. I think we should create our own coalition of political leaders who can push for this to be prioritized in the budget. And so a parliamentary forum on social protection was born out of those influencing processes. And so this reinforced our influencing initiatives, and it's been very, very critical to increasing government investment in social protection. And wherever, yes, this is my last point. Yes?
Yes, your last point.
Yes. Yeah, my last point was that wherever we were working with these partnerships, we were very keen to not just give them work, but actually give them work that suited their capabilities. So we're being very strategic about our partners. We had to offer something. And yeah, that's our experience of influencing policy in Uganda using evidence in a nuanced way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. It was so concrete and so practical. A real insight. May I ask Ollie to join us on the podium now, because Ollie will give a really different perspective as an academic, and Ollie won a prize even, so he'll tell us about his experience of influencing policy in that way.
Okay, hi guys. I'm really hoping you can hear me this time. Yeah? Hear me? All right, cool. So I'm going to just add another screen here to put a slide up. So just to give you something to follow on from as I do this, I am, as Laura said, I'm an academic, but I'm actually always crossing the border backwards and forwards, because I started off with civil society groups in Nigeria after my master's, which got me interested in politics in Africa. And after that, I now moved to journalism and then to kind of analysis from a business perspective. Finally ending up back in academia to look at some of those issues on a kind of deeper level. So I've worked kind of in different formats of writing, and I've worked in different formats of presentation, but I think that the fundamentals of doing this are kind of the same. And I'm going to draw on a few examples of things I've done more recently. So one of the things I do, I'm a research associate with Oxford African Studies Centre at the moment. Having been a lecturer there previously, I work with the policy practice as a principal, which is a great experience. And I'm also a coordinator for a thing called the Nigeria Tax Research Network, which is coordinated through the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex and supported by the Gates Foundation. And that exists to kind of help close the research evidence practitioner gap. So I think, just going to start off with something that I'm going to go through three sort of things here. I'm going to go through kind of types of policy relevant research to enlarge our thinking on it. I'm going to talk a little bit about how to land kind of pieces of research and what trajectory they might take when they kind of leave your hand. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what this means as an academic in terms of the realities of time and commitment that you might want to think through and think about your level of kind of engagement. So I'm not going to make this slide heavy at all, but just to put up, this is on types of policy relevant research. I did this because when we were working, at the moment with NTRM, we work with a cohort of Nigerian and Ethiopian researchers who are all early career researchers or researchers based in either universities or government agencies that want to enhance their kind of research into evidence skills. And we were looking at one of these things, and you have some teaching materials developed by others, and they were talking about policy relevant research. And I was reading it and I thought, actually, I fundamentally disagree with this because it's too limiting. I think what I want to do with what I have on the screen now is just to point out that, a very wide variety of research has policy relevance in different ways, and it could be quantitative research, it could be qualitative research, it could be very precise, focused testing of something research, it could be very inductive, broad research. So think about what you're doing and what you research and the way in which it's policy relevant. So, a very straightforward one, for instance, is to think about policy analysis as an academic exercise. It's a best choice comparison of various policies for the purposes of choosing what's the most suitable or the best fit in a circumstance. Doesn't always mean the ideal. It might mean the optimal, as in the most affordable in the circumstance or the most doable in the time or using the resources. So how could that be used? Maybe in policy formulation and when defining implementation processes and strategies. It's very directly relevant in theory. At totally the other end of the pole, I'm an anthropologist by training, and what we often do, it comes under maybe this heading of critical research. So, there's a lot of anthropologists who look at development policy in action, people like David Moss, who look at how policy changes in implementation, what kind of wider effects or relationships it forms that weren't intended, and how does it generate meaning and social effect and affect. And these aren't necessarily things that you might get in this kind of boiled down policy analysis. It's about looking at the bigger kind of context around it. And what could be the uses of that? Highlighting consequences and effects, some of which are very unintended, some of which are very obvious to the people involved in them, but they don't benefit by talking about them, or they don't have an interest in talking about them. It's for someone else to render visible. Things that can more critically question motives and purpose, which can be quite uncomfortable questions for many of us who are quite bought into a policy, and we all become embedded in the things we're doing. So it might take that external perspective. Another more direct one, looking at policy evaluation to determine the impact of a particular policy. So that could be internally within a program. It could be as an external evaluator. It could be as someone who's completely unrelated to that program, but feels like this is something that they want to take a look at because they have a hunch that there's something to talk about here, or to propose alternatives. So usually introduced after something has started, but ideally in program design, these days in a kind of sophisticated social program design, would expect it to be built in as a kind of thinking process on the rollout. And the last one really is kind of, if you're even thinking of something from the aspect of kind of inverted commas pure research, is propositional policy relevance, outlining possible applications of research discoveries to policy. So, this is something that people haven't even been thinking about. You're just putting it out there into a kind of blank space and looking for where it might have application. So really, if you all think about your research and the ways that it fits in, there's very little that lies completely outside that. Even what people think of as blue sky or pure research or kind of abstract or theoretical research has, those critical reflections and those kind of critical possibilities. So that's what I wanted to talk about from kind of thinking in a blue skies way. I think what I want to address now is 4 real life examples, as Laura-Len and David have done really well. Mine will be a bit more superficial because I'm going to try and cover a few different ones, but not as in much depth. And some of which I'm going to say, I think, I've learned a lot listening to the previous 2 speakers of things that we might all have in common. And I think you're going to see some of those things about alliances that have already been mentioned. Some of those things about having buzzwords or no-no words, and an emphasis on doing as well as writing is all really important. And I've discovered that as well. And it's really nice to see that we've all brought that out, actually, because apart from anything else, it makes you feel less wrong if you see that others have followed the same path. So I think the first thing to say is that, from an academic perspective, we're very much encouraged to do impact work or policy relevant work, but it's sort of quite often fondly imagined by the academic funding bodies or our colleagues or our departmental heads or our departmental evaluators that this is a lovely linear process where you put research in at the beginning and someone says, oh, thanks for that, we needed that evidence base, and they generate a policy from it, and from that policy things happen, and then it speaks back to it and it becomes, you know, an iterative process which is based on it. And you can get that linear process, but very rarely. It's the exception rather than the norm. And you have to think about the unevenness and the contingency, which are things that Laura-Len and David have both brought out. The balance between planning what you're going to do and responding to the fact that actually it's very uneven. Apart from anything else, this becomes a pain for an academic because academic funding and evaluation and job cycles are linear. So they'll give you some money to do some impact work, and then they'll expect you to tell you what you achieved. But the achievement might be 5 years down the road. You don't know. Very hard to capture that. The UK funding councils now have a pretty unusable thing called research fish, where you're supposed to log for years and years the kind of after effects of things you do, which is a step in the right direction of recognizing that these things have long afterlives. Equally, one of the realities is that you might be going into a situation which is actually fundamentally hostile to research and evidence. And I'm looking at some of the programs that I've been involved with in Nigeria, where I've worked a lot, where if you're working with systems where already there are issues with kind of ingrained interest groups, I don't usually use the word corruption because it's a very broad-based word that covers a multitude of different dynamics. But some of those dynamics, you can find places where people say they don't want an evidence base because people have a vested interest in bad policy. This isn't just a question about Nigeria. This happens in the UK as well, where bad policy allows bad spending, which some people benefit from. So you might actually find pushback against people even wanting an evidence base, which is kind of unexpected in the kind of way that the academic push thinks that evidence might work. So think about that to start with. And I think the next thing is to think about sorry, I've lost my thread there because a thing just popped up here. Yeah, okay. We're talking about political economy, and just following on, I think, directly from David's point about, you know, how to think about how things are working. Well, David and Laura-Len's point, it's to do your own political economy analysis of where you are taking your evidence, to look at how your organization works. So I'm going to give, you know, the people that you're trying to speak to, or the field, the kind of terrain of dialogue around an issue. How does that work? What pushes it? What drives it? What are the intervention points? What are the restrictions? There's no point just writing something and expecting everybody to love it straight away. So to give you 4 examples very quickly, the first, I was working on policing in Nigeria for my PhD research. And in that, I discovered a lot of things that really might be known at the lower ranks of policing, but aren't speakable. And the issue on the political economy of the police is, 1, it's a hierarchical organization. So things flow downwards. 2, it's an institution that's very sensitive about information. And 3, it's an institution where by the time you get into leadership, you're basically at the end of your career. So most people at the top leadership have kind of got their agenda already and are kind of playing it out. And, you know, so I read a great adage once, the worst mistake in politics is to think that you change things by talking to leaders. Well, that wasn't always the case, but it definitely isn't sufficient to talk to leaders. So the answers in that case were to put that stuff out there at all levels of the organization and talk to people who are in leadership, talk to the upcoming generation who might be coming to leadership, and then talk to stakeholders in policing outside. Because of that sensitivity to information, if we'd have started by going outside and talking to civil society, the police would have become hostile to it and said, this is kind of tale-telling. But to start out with the police by saying, this is what we found, these are some of the issues, what's your feedback on it, and then going outwards. So you think about that process of what happens when. Secondly, some of my experience working on tax. You might think that there is this huge appetite for an evidence base, but actually one of the political economy issues around taxation is that there are a lot of consultants, tax consultants, including everything from the big 4 accountancy firms to very local tax consultancies in certain towns that take percentages from revenue farming, that see information as a market advantage. And so the idea that someone's going to come in there and try to give away free information and form relationships on that, it's actually quite threatening. You actually find people in those areas and people inside the organizations that have partnerships with them pushing back a little bit and not really wanting that to happen. Well, what's the answer to that? The answer really, I think, that we've kind of come to is partly to work where there's a pull. There's no point pushing on a closed door. It's to work with those people who do want to have those relationships and do as much as quickly with those people. The other is to put it out there as widely as possible and just to influence the debate generally and to put it out there in all the forums that people are talking about tax and revenue. Because we're not trying to be jealous of our achievements. We're not trying to form exclusive relationships. We want the data to be out there so whoever picks it up, and if you get a critical mass behind that, becomes orthodoxy. There are two more tricky situations that I've recently been involved in that I just want to highlight to you. And I'm going to make 3 points. 1, 2, 3. I can see Laura Len is getting ready to push me out the door. But I think these are important. One is I've been recently supplying evidence to an all-party parliamentary group investigating interfaith conflict in Nigeria. And I and several other kind of academics who work in that area have consistently made the point that this isn't about faith per se. Faith becomes an issue, but it's about wider conflict drivers. However, when the report got launched, we can see that some of the politicians who went behind the process had an agenda and framed it in a faith-based manner, which is totally unconstructive from our point of view. So now we're having to, those of us who provided some of the evidence who disagree with that position, write letters sort of testifying that I'm quoted in here, but I don't want to be associated with the findings. So think about that role of embeddedness versus your ability to back away and say, no, I'm a distinct voice. You need to keep that autonomy. And the last example, there are pushes from big bureaucracies who you would think would know better. I am working currently on a project around some environmental issues, and the World Bank is a player in it. And we just included a phase in that project to go and gather evidence on ground about what interventions are suitable for which places, because they're very variable. And because the World Bank has an incentive in spending money, people's careers in the World Bank have an incentive on spending money. And we've ended up with a situation where they've actually taken the budget for producing the evidence base out of the project and said proceed straight to implementation, which of course vastly raises the risk of that money being wasted and misspent. So we now have to push back and even create the case for evidence to start with. Those are 4 real life examples. I just wanted to give you the academic last line on it, I think, which is all of our departments as academics encourage us to do this stuff, and we can be entered for prizes, and that's been a very nice experience. But really have a look at 2 things. One is, if this is the direction you want to go in, and it's great for its own sake, I really think we're all in this session because we have things that we want to contribute to, and that's fantastic. But if you're looking at it in terms of the academic career, look at exactly how it is weighted in your department, because they will all say this is really valuable. But if you look at things like promotion criteria, if you look at things like staff retention, how much are they based on that and how much on academic publication? And think about the balance of your time. And 2, because it's not linear and because it's not simple, it's time consuming. It's very time consuming and it has a long afterlife. So I would make those decisions before you start your intervention rather than finding out the hard way halfway through. I think I'll park it there.
Thank you, Alan. It was really exciting to have this other perspective. I would like to ask for David to join us on stage, because we're going to have some time to have a bit of questions from you guys, and then we'll go into the exercise. So to ask questions, you just write them in the question box, and then my colleague Alex will publish the questions. Because David, you're on stage, is there a question you'd like to ask either Ollie or myself as we get started?
No, I don't have any specific questions, but actually it's very interesting. You know, it was very interesting listening to you, Laurelyn, about your experience in DFID. I think it strikes me, you know, when I was making preparation for this conference, how much, you know, DFID is very keen on evidence in policy, and, you know, it's a government institution. I think I can't say the same for, you know, government. Research isn't as valued as it is. But when I look at the amount of analysis that was conducted before this program was designed, because, you know, it's DFID money, it's really, really, really helpful, because all the achievements we've made, all the strategies we've implemented have actually been anchored in the analysis that was conducted at the beginning. So it's really, really interesting to hear that. And of course, Ollie's point about the political economy is equally important, because you can conduct research that nobody's going to take. I mean, there are people who don't want to hear the evidence you're providing, either because they're ideologically opposed to it, or they have these incentives not to do the right thing. So yeah, it's a very complex process, this policy making process, based on evidence. So yeah, it's very insightful to listen to all your submissions. Thank you.
Great, David. So we're not seeing any questions popping up. You can also raise your hand if we can bring you on stage, but any burning questions? Because
I think, okay, is that somebody?
Ollie, go ahead. Oh, we have one raised hand.
Okay, let's deal with them as they come in then, maybe. Okay, maybe we just I'll make a comment while we're waiting if there's more questions to collate, and then afterwards we can go back to all of us and see how we answer.
So we've got one first question, and I hope you can speak. But just go ahead.
Thanks for an interesting presentation. I submitted 2 questions via email. Maybe I would like to ask them. I can't retrieve them from my laptop to post them on the chat. I manage a team of researchers comprised by economists and other policy researchers. The question I asked was, what are the typical stages of producing a policy paper, right from conceptualization, maybe up to, like one of the speakers, up to where you go out and publish the results. The reason for that is as a person managing this team, I'm looking for how to allocate responsibilities and how to map the process for the team, so that the team clearly understands the various stages of the workflow that it will take to produce a paper and ultimately take it out, get it engaged and adopted by decision makers. Thanks.
Great, thank you. We're going to take a range of questions. So I'm going to publish a question for everyone to look at. The question is, I wondered if Ollie thinks that the increased focus on impact cases in the REF will make a difference to how this is valued by departments. So this is more question from the point of view of UK academics. Before we answer, could someone go on mute? There's someone with some background noise. Any other questions for the panel, either in person or written? No. Okay. In that case, can I ask David, can you try to answer the first question about how to organize a team and how to deal with the workflow? Oh.
I'm not sure I got the actual question.
No, it was a question. It was a colleague who came on stage, and what I understood is that he's managing a team and he wants to know how to allocate staff to do what roles. I mean, I'll just make a comment to get started, which I think the issue is about recognizing the different skills people have in your team. So you'll have a range of academics. Some of them will be really good at doing written research and communicating on paper. Others will be good at this kind of networking point that I was mentioning earlier. So I think you really have to consider what those skills are. And in terms of timing, you can time your research process, how long it will take to gather the evidence, how long it might take to write. Though in general, academics always take much longer to write than they say they will. So you always have to build in that time frame of delays and final drafts right at the end. But then how long it takes to actually influence policymakers, that's really, really difficult, because it can take forever. It can take decades, or it can be, if there's a window, this is the time when you can come in and make a difference. So that's my starter for 10. But David, you might have other thoughts.
Yes, actually, I thought that what you've just said, Laura, will be interesting, because that's exactly what happened to me. When I joined the Expanding Social Protection Program, I joined as an economist to coordinate the research. But I also had a lot of relationship building capabilities. And so when it became obvious that we needed to get into more advocacy and influencing work, my supervisor just decided to reassign me. So she asked me, say, David, you seem to know a lot of people. You seem to get along with these people. I think you should take on the advocacy role. So I think you can put jobs out there and say this is the job description, but sometimes I think that it's existing skills within the organization that you need to be able to leverage. And so again, as someone who understood the economics of social protection and could coordinate the analysis, I was able to marry that technical capability with my social skills to do the influencing work. So there is one process of getting the right people there based on the terms of reference of the work you want them done. But I think once they are on the team, you can actually identify some nuanced characters and attributes that can be helpful for doing specific things. The other point is I was very good at events management. And so most of our influencing work required organizing conference and stuff. And these were really, it made the job very easy for me. Where we would have had to hire an events manager, I was doing the events management. So picking out some of the existing skills within the team can actually be very helpful, and then calling on additional support when necessary. Over.
Thanks, David. So now to Ollie, this UK question on the IREF, and you may need to explain what it is for our colleagues from outside the UK.
Okay. And then we have another question after that as well. So just
go for it.
So, but I'm actually going to just follow up a little bit on the first question as well. Just to say that I think another answer to your question is that you have to think about the bandwidth of your team, right? And or yourself or your organization. It might be what level of resource do you want to devote to each issue. If you've got an ongoing research program, you might want to publish a lot of briefing papers, but you might need to think about which ones you're going to push at what time, because there are finite resources, right? And that's what we always come back to is, you can't do everything at once. And so that's really important on a personal level as well as a team level. The REF, the Research Excellence Framework in the UK, which is how university departments are funded via research money, and that is the main money that universities currently get, used to look at research-only publications, and now it has a role of looking at the impact of research outside academia. And so in theory, it has changed what departments do, right? But actually in practice, what they do is they do impact case studies. They follow up, so-and-so did a great piece of research on this, and it turned into that, and we can trace that. So it's tilted towards those people that can trace their impact. So that gives us three, I think, lessons. One is, don't let the birds eat the trail of crumbs when you go into the forest of evidence. It's about documenting what comes out where. But two, also that if you're working with an organization, like when I was doing my police research, you might see your ideas get taken up, but nobody is ever going to attribute them to you, because to work effectively in a hierarchical organization, you let people in that hierarchy take credit for things, and you don't push your own credit for it. So very difficult to work effectively and create that evidence trail for the impact case study. And kind of ineffective. And I think the third thing is just as consultants, I think that a lot of the thing that evidence producers do more often than promoting new things is stopping existing bad things being as bad, whether it's kind of money that's being wasted in a certain way or policies that are having negative outcomes. And it's quite hard to trace things that didn't happen and create an evidence trail out of that. So I think that there's a lot of problems with the way that those case studies are collected. And I think I would say to all of us is we all, if we're going to get into this as academics, need to get ourselves a bit more training on documentation. And I also think that, training in the kind of skills that David and Laura Ellen have been talking about influencing, is just as key as the writing skills, and probably the kind of thing that we should be able to use our academic funding to do courses.
Great. Thanks, Ollie. So we've got 3 more questions, and I'm going to take them in turn, and then we'll respond to all of them. So we're going to bring on stage Anna, who is from Sao Paulo. I hope we can hear you this time. Go ahead, share your question.
Yes, can you hear me now?
We can hear you perfectly. Go ahead.
Oh, fantastic. Let me see if I can get...
No, that's fine. Just go and ask your question. It's okay.
Oh, that's absolutely fine. So thank you for everything. And I'm here in this workshop basically because I'm a PhD candidate at King's College in the University of Sao Paulo. And I'm studying philanthropic funding to environmental organizations in Brazil. But I began working as a parliamentary research assistant here in the UK. And I found that incredibly
I think Anna is having a problem connecting, because I can see on her screen.
Great. Okay, go ahead, Anna. Go ahead,
Can
Anna.
you hear me?
We can hear you. Go ahead.
Oh,
Keep going.
perfect. Yeah, sorry, connection's kind of terrible today. Yeah, so I grew more and more interest about policy and evidence and research that can help policy, basically, and that became my job. So, and Ollie has answered several of my questions. That's mostly about what to do with evidence in a world that has grown quite skeptical of it, and how you deal with the sort of situations. But also, I wanted to check, because that was very helpful, the types of policy relevant research from the kind of first slide, and to ask if there's any sort of further material on that, because that's kind of perfect to frame this kind of policy relevant research. And also, if there is, that you know of, any repository of cases of kind of academic work informing policy, a website or a blog or a group or a place you can go to find that kind of information. And
Great.
I'm kind of finishing. I have one more question, if that's okay.
Quickly.
Yes. Is that you, kind of, Laureline, you mentioned networks and how to build those. Because it's easier when you are within a field, like political economy or international relations or development. But when you are kind of working with a politician, sometimes you have to work with loads of different kind of fields and different kind of academics. So how to reach out to those people, how to map out who is doing important work that can be useful, like searching well-known institution or going on Twitter. So how that can be done.
Great. Thanks for your 3 questions. I'm going to take you off stage because we have some questions from colleagues as well. Thanks a lot, Anna. Thank you. So I'm going to publish a question first from Alice, who's, sorry. Are we able to, can we publish the question? Yes. So the question from Alex, she's researching global chains of agriculture and impact requires action from multiple stakeholders. How would you approach policy writing for this? That's a question that was linked to what we said. How do you actually approach policy writing to influence many stakeholders? And another question that I'm going to publish comes from Hamid from the British Council in Sudan. Well, research policy briefs can be challenged by the lack of political will and might fail to influence policymakers. Any insights or any advice on this? So we had we actually had 5 questions, 3 from Anna and then 2 written questions just now. David, do you want to try to answer some of the points that were made? You don't have to answer all the questions, but any responses you'd like to give to some of the points?
Okay, I can try to answer the last question about, the lack of political will. And then I think that it's very important for researchers and policymakers to understand the political economy of the sectors within which they work. Because I believe it was, I think it was both of you who mentioned how sometimes, I think it was Ollie in Nigeria, there are certain things that policymakers don't want to hear. And so as a researcher, you really need to understand your audience before you write, because otherwise then it's just an academic exercise. In my experience in Uganda, we've tried to understand our key audiences for the research. In fact, the research has been influenced by what these, we call them advocacy targets, are looking for. So if we are writing research or an analytical piece of work that's targeting social protection financing in fiscal space, it's targeted at Ministry of Finance, and you really need to understand what they're worried about and try to tailor your research to address those concerns. But if you write something that's very general, and say this is factual, it really may not hit the mark because it doesn't address their issue. but also they can, in my experience, use the lack of specificity in your research to actually dispute the findings. So understanding what the audience's needs are, their key concerns are. If they are opposed, you need to know I'm writing for an opposed audience, and at the very least you can do that to minimize the level of opposition. I did not hear most of what Anna said because I couldn't see what whether she was on screen. So maybe if you can summarize, if there was any question that was directed at me.
No, they were more directed for Ollie, really. So thank you so much, David. Ollie, can you try to answer some of Anna's points and also the point made that I'll publish again about action from multiple stakeholders, which is this question from Alice.
Okay, so I'm going to start with Anna's. Somebody isn't on mute and it's making a kind of metallic noise. I don't know if someone can.
David, could you come in? Thank you.
Okay. So this is a kind of part of the reason that we're doing this actually is because there aren't that many useful kind of places to discuss these issues and bring them out. The kind of typology that I did was something that I had to produce because I felt that the things I could find out there weren't adequate. And if you think it was useful, that's great. And maybe we can work that up into something a bit more kind of finalized and neat and polished. But I think that actually the ref impact case studies that have been done will have to be public and will have to be published. So you can go and look at some of them. There are some resources around those. I think you were looking at how to access people in specific fields. The GSDRC research papers from Birmingham have already been mentioned, that the DFID Commission is an evidence base. There are a lot of those on a lot of issues, which are basically like somebody else has read up on this and knows who thinks what. And you can go through theirs and I think those intermediate level kind of literature review overviews are really useful to then go, oh, okay, good, I'm going to follow up on this person, this aspect. They're really good kind of ways in, because the problem with academia and accessing academic knowledge is that the political economy of academia is we get paid to publish, therefore we're always publishing and there's more and more stuff to read and not all of it is good. So, it's really good to have these kind of intermediate steps. I don't really advocate this thing that happens now. I've seen of people doing literature reviews by algorithm, which seems kind of no more sophisticated than a Wordle, really. I don't think you can do it like that. But things that are intermediate level review articles are really handy for that. On the political will question from Hamid, I think, you've also got to realize that sometimes the people in power are not the people with the political will that are going to make this happen. So, for instance, if you were in the UK right now and you wanted to make a case about the importance of separating overseas development aid from national strategic goals, you're not going to go to the government in power to make that case because they've just decided they're not interested and they would rather burn that agenda down. You're going to go to who? You're going to go to NGOs who work on it. You're going to go to watchdogs who work on it. You might go to opposition political parties to work on it. You might go to organizations in other countries or organizations that look at the quality of aid spending to make those points. And then eventually you hope that feeds into the policymaking process through turnover and a longer conversation. Because one of the things that Laura Len pointed out is that even single organizations change massively over time in the way that they want to use evidence or the kind of evidence they want to hear about. And Alice's question about multiple stakeholders, that's maybe when, you have to just admit that the written content is kind of quite straight. That's not where the political nous is going to be. You're going to be just putting the evidence in the written content in a way that kind of is appealing and transparent to everybody. And that where you're going to do the targeting is in how you deliver it. But equally, I think that I've brought kind of civil society groups and police and academics together around the policing research in Nigeria. It worked well. You get different responses in the room from responses out of the room. People from hierarchical organizations don't like to say things in rooms, if their boss isn't there especially. But if they're in the room to start with the other stakeholders, the conversation gets going, you can follow up outside. So I think you produce something that has more general application and then you target it, and that's more of a fruitful way to approach that question.
Great, thank you, Ollie. David, do you want to add anything?
Yes, I wanted to say something actually in relation to this question about how do you approach multiple stakeholders? But also, I think it applies to the question of political will. I think academics and policymakers need to realize that actually change takes a long time. In my experience, I've seen advisors who have come to DFID and used just one event to make a decision. I mean, at one point in 2017, DFID was threatening to cut the expanding social protection program because government wasn't meeting its share of the contributions to the budget. And this was in total oblivion of all the work and the political support that had been exhibited previously. And this was just one event. So I think you really need to have a focus on the long term and the focus on the big picture. And for specific stakeholders, you must know who they are, what they want. And so if you've conducted a study, you must pick out the evidence that speaks to a specific group of people. And in your communication, you have to have nuance. So make sure you can dissect your audiences and, for lack of a better word, tell each audience what they want to, and then what they need to hear. Over.
Brilliant, David. What I'd like to do now, because actually we titled this about policy writing. Just wait, Ollie, one second. Policy writing. I think we've got an exercise. Just 1 second, Ollie. We have an exercise. I'm wondering whether we might go and do the exercise so people can get the chance to see 2 documents and make some comments. But to do that, I will hand over to Ollie.
Sorry, Laura-Len, I've just realised you've been so enthusiastic and capable in chairing, you actually haven't provided your own responses to any of the questions. So we should give you opportunity to do that in case you had a contribution you want to make.
Thank you for offering me the floor, but I think you've all covered the examples that I was going to raise. But if anyone has a specific question to me, I'm happy to answer it later. But I would really like actually to see if there's appetite in the room to do this short exercise that Ollie has prepared for us, because we had advertised this as policy writing. And one of the points I was making is about how you communicate your messages in writing and how you choose your words, but also how it's presented on the page matters, and whether it's visually, it catches your eye is actually also important. So Ollie, over to you on that.
Okay, we have about 25 minutes left in this session. And I'm going to give you an exercise to do, and that exercise I'm going to load up just now. You can see, let me talk. Well, actually, I'll talk about it first so that you're not distracted by reading and talking at the same time. But basically, I've got 2 examples of policy relevant research papers. You can pick the one you want to do. I'm going to give you a bit of time to go through them, and there are 3 questions I'd like you to think about as a reader. And then at the end, I'm going to give you 10 minutes for that. And then we're going to reconvene at the end, and we're going to hear back from you. I guess as we can use the question format or the text box if you can't use the question format to give your answers to that, or we can call you up to do it. And just to see, what the author intended versus the outcome can be different, and the different aspects that come into it. I also want to emphasize that I'm not going to give you enough time to do this, and that's deliberate, because like Laura-Len said at the beginning, almost always you've thought that the person who's going to read your research has got more time to do it than they actually have. So I'm going to take, it's 38 minutes past 12 right now. I'm going to give you till 48 minutes past 12. And you can get to the distance that you can with what you're looking at. But first of all, let me just show you what the instructions are. Okay, I'll do it 10 minutes from when we actually start. So select file, here we go. Let's put this back up. Right, so the first thing is, here are the 2 URLs that you can now click or cut and paste if the clicking through doesn't work. You can either choose this paper by the Young Lives program, which was a big kind of multi-year big data program funded by DFID, looking at the lives of young people in 4 different countries around the world on youth labour, if that's more to your interest. Or you can look at this paper that I did on anthropological research on policing communal conflict. So first of all, kind of cut and paste or click the one that you want to use. Just give you a minute to do that. And Alex says, thanks, Alex has posted them in the text chat as well. I don't think they're live links in the text chat. You have to cut and paste them from there. Anyway, so since they're up on the text chat as well, I'll now move to the exercise questions. So there are 3 things, really read this with these 3 things in mind, and I'll leave this there as well. The first question is, what do you see as being the single most important message this paper is trying to pass on? What's the key? What's the nub? And then secondly, pick out some of the strengths and weaknesses of how that message and the paper is written and packaged, and what helps it to get across, what doesn't really help. And then 3, put yourself in the shoes of the author. Think about that kind of what you imagine the political economy of the field that you're looking at might be. And think if you had to, one chance, because time, bandwidth, attention spans are always limited. If you had one chance to influence a key actor or constituency that you thought could do something about it with it, which actor or constituency would you pick, and how might you go about that? What are some of the ideas of different approaches? Maybe drawing on what you've heard today, maybe drawing on your own experience, maybe drawing on ideas you're having. So, okay, it's now 22. So I'm going to give you 10 minutes for that. We'll reconvene at 10 to and talk through it. And hopefully I'm going to leave you with a little bit of music to listen through. We'll check in once or twice to see how it's going. If you have any more specific questions, post them in the text chat. Okay. What we're going to do now is just kind of round up a bit you're on, and then if we can, Alex, if you can allow the open podium, we can start feeding back on what we want. So what we're going to do, the way we're going to do it, we're going to do a round of responses to the first question, then a round of responses to the second question, then a round of responses to the third question. Otherwise, we'll only hear from 2 or 3 people and not everybody. So obviously, not a lot of time to hear from everybody. So just make your 2 or 3 key points that you'd like to make. But who'd like to kind of contribute first on the first question about the key message? Okay. Thea, yeah, how you doing?
Hi, okay. So, well, I'm a postgraduate student at University of Birmingham, and I'm taking up economics. Mm-hmm. So like, the first question is, say, the key takeaway, right? So my key takeaway is that, so I read the first paper, and then, so my key takeaway is that youth labor could be rooted on the pervasive poverty situation in the area, which is, the poverty situation is also exacerbated by violence-based context in that area. And it is a must that the solution must be centered on education, and that it is age and gender sensitive, and that it is a mixed method.
Okay, so it's making a connection between the contextual drivers and the way in which you should frame the problem. That would be the That's great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Anybody else want to contribute how they felt that whether they agree that's the same message, or whether there were other things that came through differently? Alice, hi. How are you?
Yes, hi. I'm good. I don't know whether I went to the wrong paper, the one for the Ethiopia, the young lives in Ethiopia. Was that the right one?
The one about child labor, was it that one?
This was about young lives in Ethiopia.
Not the same paper, but okay. I mean, since you read it, okay, tell us what you...
Okay, so this one was about a research that followed the Ethiopian youth, 2 cohorts of groups, and then followed them a few years later. So what I got, the main message I got from this one is that there's a lot of disparity based on gender, and also based on the rural to urban differences. So for example, in the rural areas, there were more children were not transiting to secondary school. They were still stuck at the primary level. And then the rural occupations were mostly agriculture. People were not employed. So yeah, I got the wrong one, but I learned something.
So it's not a wasted 10 minutes then?
No.
Okay, great. Thanks. Anybody else want to contribute on the either of the paper on the first question? Okay, let me see if there's anything in the chat box or anyone's done it. You can also do it as a question or a raise hand if you're not having any luck coming up to the podium. Any other responses on the kind of main message in the brief? If there's no other responses, I'm going to assume that everybody is happy with what was said about the first brief, and that mine was so awful that no one wants to say anything, but that's okay. Okay. Also, by the way, I don't know if Laura or David have got any, have looked at those and have any particular kind of things they want to bring out, but you can also feel free to chip in. Otherwise, we move to the second question. And so what are, looking at the one that you read, what are the key kind of what strengths and weaknesses, stuff that you might be useful take homes from strengths and weaknesses side from how they're written in patterns. Jill is here. Hi.
Hi. Yeah, I didn't read your paper only because the other one's more relevant to what I study.
Okay.
But I looked at the children's voices and work one. On a really simple level, they used colour very well to help things stand out, and the use of questions as well made it very clear when they were moving on to the next point. On the minuses, I felt it missed a conclusion, something at the end to sort of bring it together, and also who to contact if you wanted to know more. I mean, it said who the organizations were that were involved, but there was no contact details. And so if people want to, follow it up or take it on, it would have taken a bit of searching around to find who to do that with. That's all.
No, those are really good points, I think. Basic usability. Don't forget the actual basics of communication, right? And then the issue about color and formatting. Then don't skimp on the editorial side, right? Because that's not irrelevant. It's how you interact with a piece of information. Yeah. Any other? Okay, David is coming on. It's gone again. You've both gone. Anybody else as a raised hand or on the podium on strengths and weaknesses of either of the papers? Okay, Anna, how are you?
Hi, and I also read the paper about youth and children's voices, and I completely agree with Jill's points, but I have to add that as a positive, it sets out clear recommendations. I love that. You can go there, you can see, okay, what can I tell a policymaker to do? So you can just summarize those points or have key points and give it to someone else. But I understand why it's important to listen to children and to your constituency, but it's not clear by reading the paper. So if you're giving it to someone who might not be convinced or might think that children's voices are not that important for any reason, maybe a paragraph on that, like what is kind of child labor and child work, and then why it's important to listen to children, maybe papers on psychology or anthropology, something to give a basis to that. So why that's important in the first place, because some people might actually contend with that. And that was it.
Thanks. Thanks for that. Yeah, no, really important. Don't forget why the research is important to start with. I don't know, any other responses on this part, or do we move to, I'm going to have a look for some, otherwise we move to the third question. David is here.
Hi, sorry, I got disconnected. I just had the comment on, I read the paper on child labor, incorporating working children's views in policy making. So I think it's got a very clear, the message is clear if you see the title, that this is a paper about children's views. But when you actually go through the paper beyond the second page, the message of the children isn't very clear. So I thought that this is one of the papers that it's got a very important message, but it gets lost in the paper trying to incorporate all the results of the study. So it doesn't very prominently bring out the voice of the children on the subject. So that's what I thought was the problem.
I think that's a really nice point. The medium should also be the message. If your paper is bringing out the voices of children, where are the voices of children in your papers are really, you can get called out on that. Thanks. Somebody just popped up and then vanished again. I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, maybe it's a connection issue, to try and pop up again. Otherwise, we move to the last. Laura-Len is going to round up this session, but before that, we have one more question. So, your ideas about who were the key people, if you had one chance, who are you going to target with this piece that you read? If anyone's got strong ideas on that, if anyone wants to chip on that, who could you target stuff at or to, and how? So I'll give you a couple of minutes to maybe some people are trying to chip in now. Okay, Jill is coming.
Yeah, hi again. I was just going to say, I think they make a really good point about the language and talking about children's work rather than child labour. And so looking at the sort of groups that use that sort of discourse and trying to show them how they might want to change that. So NGO advocacy groups for children, those types of things would be a small change, but it could help to link onto other debates you might have with them anyway after that.
Thanks. That's really important. And I guess another kind of reinforcement that not all advocacy is to government directly. Policymaker doesn't equate government straight. Anybody else coming in on that? Is that okay? No. Okay, yeah, Thea.
Okay, so I think like it should be also towards the local community, since in context-wise you have like a violence-based context. So at least it addresses that. So if you would have an education intervention, it also kind of buffers with the violence-based context with a local community approach. So there, yeah.
Thanks.
So I think
it's not all about the kind of elite-focused advocacy. It's also about local-focused advocacy. Fantastic. I thought my own one reading it was that trade unions and the union labour movement, actually this ties children's labour to the issue of unseen labour generally and what trade union advocates might be into. And that's also another different aspect. I don't think anyone else is chipping in on this. So given that we're about on time, it's 1:01, I think I should hand over to say thanks to everyone for engaging with that and your thoughts and getting stuck into it. Should hand back to Laura-Len to round up the session.
To the stage. I didn't say anything because unfortunately I read the policy brief on Nigeria because I used to live in Nigeria and work on policing. So I'll give Ollie my feedback separately. I hope you've enjoyed this session. We were trying to be much more interactive than the other panels are. And it's been quite tricky using Shinding rather than to have an in-person workshop. But I think it worked. And I want to say a huge thank you to all of you who asked questions, had the courage to go to the podium to make your points. And this was really just a taster for policy influencing work. What I would like to ask you to do, if you've got further questions or any feedback, to actually just email us through the Shinding platform. You can actually send to the convener some messages. So I'd love to hear from you what you learned, what you thought we did well in this session, how could we do this differently, and if you feel there's an appetite for more advice on this kind of issue. I know colleagues in ODI, for example, have entire research programs on how to influence policy, but it might be that there's some tips we could put out in the public domain. So that was my sort of final concluding thoughts from me. And I've also enjoyed hearing from you what your questions were. But I'd like to give David the chance for any final comments or thoughts as we finish the session.
Thank you very much, Laura-Len, for inviting me to this very, very exciting discussion. I think, you know, having worked on the ground, getting my hands dirty, I think it's good to kind of put my head up and look back where we've come from and where we might go. So it was really useful to listen to your insights on the policymaking process. And so thank you very much. And to the academics, I really hope that this helps to focus and improve the precision of their research as well as uptake, because if you can understand the political economy of the subject, you have, I think, a much better chance at causing change. Thank you very much.
Okay, and Ollie, any final thoughts?
Well, I've just really enjoyed it and really enjoyed hearing the questions and hearing from both of you too. And I know we have another chance to hear from David and Laura-Len in this conference, but I should hand back to you to tell us about that actually. But yeah, just thank you everybody as well.
Great, and Ollie had forgotten. So basically tomorrow, David and I are back on stage. We've got a session looking at how aid programs can actually support local leadership. In my experience, some programs fail utterly to support local leadership, but we found 3 great programs that claim to be doing really well. So David will be one of our main speakers, and he'll say a bit more about the Uganda Social Protection Program. But we also have a case study from Nigeria about women in leadership, and a case study of Kenya, local governance, and how to work with social accountability tools. So we hope you can make it. It's tomorrow at 9 o'clock, panel 31. Thank you, everyone. I've really enjoyed this today as well.